So I wanted to delve into the trinity of Plato, Socrates, or I should say Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and delve a little bit into Plato's system of questions, if you will. So it's a good starting point to say that Socrates was condemned to death in 399 BC. And then afterwards, Plato took the Socratic spirit of perpetual questioning and advanced it forward through an academic institution which he built after Socrates' death. Now, what's ought to be recognized here is that Socrates himself did not create any academic institutions. He did not create a school. All he was doing, per his account, is that, or I should say, per his view, is that he was simply inquiring and engaging in philosophical inquiry. And so he was only posing questions, and in so doing, attaining answers. And so in his view, in the view of Socrates, he was not imparting knowledge, at least his methodology of philosophical teaching was not didactic. He was not instructing people, he was simply posing questions. Now, this is not fully true if we take a look at some of Socrates' apparent doctrines. For example, the only harm is harm to the soul. The only injustice is whereby you have a soul that is harmed. And so long as your soul is not harmed, then you are good. Now, Plato came after Socrates. Plato was influenced by Socrates, and he built this academic institution, and he advanced forward various dialogues, such as the Republic and other dialogues. And what's ought to be recognized here is that Plato sought to create a system, a philosophical system. And the focus here are the interconnectedness and intertwined questions that he posed. So there are fundamental philosophical questions, central philosophical questions, if you will, pivotal questions that Plato touched upon. In fact, one might argue that Plato touched upon most of the philosophical questions that we know of today. And so what Plato did is what he sought to do is to build a system, a philosophical system, based on the Socratic spirit of perpetual questioning. And so these questions that Plato posed are not independent of one another. They're not detached from one another. In fact, they are not only dependent to one another, but they have an inherent order in which, to answer one question, you need the answer of another question. So, for example, some of the fundamental philosophical questions that Plato posed include, what is the right kind of life? So what is an appropriate kind of life? What is an appropriate society, or what is the right kind of society? What is knowledge? How is knowledge attained? What is the fundamental nature of reality? These questions are not only dependent on one another, but they have an order to one another. And to answer one question, you need the answer to another question. And so in attempting to create a philosophical system using the Socratic spirit, Plato sought to pose these questions. Some of them have been posed by his predecessors, and then attain answers through the Socratic spirit, through dialogues, through philosophical dialogue and inquiry. And not only that, he thought that because those questions are interconnected, then the answers must be interconnected and linked to one another, and thus you'd have a set of answers that in combination to one another would make sense and would be on the same wavelength, if you will. And so this is what Plato sought to do. And so he sought to create a philosophical system using the Socratic spirit. I mentioned the trinity of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. As I said earlier, Socrates did not create a school of thought. To be precise, he did not create an academic institution, but Plato did. And and Aristotle did. So Socrates influenced Plato. Plato, in turn, influenced Aristotle. Socrates did not create an academic institution. Plato did. Aristotle also did. And so I'll delve into the works of Plato and Aristotle, and thus in delving into Plato's work, we learn about Socrates. But I'll delve into Plato's work and Aristotle's works in other modules. But I did want to talk a little bit about Plato as a man. So Plato himself came from a rich family. He came from an aristocratic family. He was apolitical. He did not engage in politics in Athens. He himself believed that states should be run by philosopher kings. There is one exception in which Plato played an advisory role to the government of Syracuse, because, and the only reason he accepted that is because the ruler of Syracuse was an admirer of Plato, and so this was an opportunity for Plato to advance his philosophical lens through an advisory role of a governing role. But Plato himself was apolitical, and again, he came from a wealthy family. In fact, if you look at the dialogues of Plato, much of the individuals in which he's engaging in dialogue with are relatives of Plato with influential roles in Athens at the time. So Plato sought to create this philosophical system, and he touched upon many of the questions that we ask today, many of the philosophical questions that are asked today. In fact, some might say that all philosophy are footnotes of Plato. Forgot which philosopher said that, but the idea here is that Plato sought to create a philosophical system. He did so using the Socratic spirit of perpetual questioning. He believed that all questions are interconnected with one another. All the fundamental, central, pivotal questions in philosophy are connected with one another. Not only are they connected and dependent on one another, not only are they not detached from one another, but they also have an inherent order. And to answer one question, you need the answer of another question. In fact, oftentimes, when you ask the great philosophical questions, you need a set of sub-questions to answer and agree upon first, so that you can answer the greater questions. So you need to answer the sub-questions to answer the greater questions. And so some of the questions, as I said earlier, include: what is the right kind of life? What is the right kind of society? What is knowledge? How is knowledge attained? What's the fundamental nature of reality? These are all fundamental philosophical questions that Plato posed and sought answers for through philosophical dialogue and through the Socratic spirit. And so what I wanted to focus on here is, first of all, who is Plato? Plato is an individual that was influenced by Socrates, and thus went on to create an academic institution. After Socrates' death in 399 BC, Plato was, in other words, some might say Plato was condemned to death because he, quote-unquote, corrupted the youth, and he, quote-unquote, corrupted Plato. But the idea here is, and we ought to be glad that he corrupted Plato, but the idea here is that what's ought to be recognized here is that Plato sought to create a philosophical system, and he sought to do so through the Socratic spirit. And so I'll delve into the questions that Plato poses and the answers for which we can attain the knowledge that we can attain from the philosophical inquiry that Plato engages in, by delving into the various dialogues of Plato in some of the next modules. And then delve into Aristotle's work in later modules as well.